us. So Russia and China have blocked attempts to condemn the violence in Syria, saying there's no grounds to interfere, but some countries seem determined to go ahead. What do you think is the driving force behind their initiative?
Well, I don't know exactly what their motivations is, but I think the problem with Syria is exactly what was predictable when they intervened in Libya. You see, once they intervene in Libya, people will say, why don't you intervene elsewhere? The first thing was, why don't you intervene in Bahrain, and why don't you intervene in Gaza, about Israel and so on? But there it was against intervention, against their allies, and of course they were not going to intervene against their allies. But now there is the problem of Syria and potentially Iran, so they are asked to intervene against their enemies. The problem is that those enemies, namely Syria and Iran, are much bigger and stronger than Libya. So I think they're afraid of intervening in Syria and Libya, in Syria and Iran, because they've already had enough problems in Iraq and in Afghanistan and so on. So I think they hesitate to intervene militarily. Nevertheless, the logic of their intervention in Libya is that they should intervene in Syria also and everywhere, and potentially they would be led into a generalized war in the Middle East.
Now, at the same time,
I myself think, yes.
Well, at the same time, we're seeing reports that Bashar al-Assad, we're seeing video from the streets, that he stepped into the deadly crackdown in recent days, unleashing the army, snipers, tanks, plainclothes police who have allegedly fired on protesters. People are dying every day. How else could the international community address this?
Well, the problem is there is no such thing as the international community. You see, the recklessness of the policies of the United States over the last 10 years have made sure that there is no international community, because people are wary of the intentions and the policies of the United States, who have waged war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, now in Libya. And you see that Russia and China are skeptical of what the United States want to do. There is no international community. It's been destroyed. So if it would be desirable to have a real international community's action, then we would need to have had a previous peace policy, which simply does not exist. Now I think there is nothing that can be done in Syria. You see, what is collapsing in the Arab world is the Western policy. The Western policy has been to demonize certain countries like Iran, support other countries like Saudi Arabia, the Mubarak regime, Ben Ali and other regimes, which were not better or more democratic than Iran, but they supported them because they were friendly to the West, or friendly to Israel, or friendly to our oil interests, or whatever. And also to wage war in Iraq. I've always said that once you start doing this policy, it's going to backfire. And now it's backfiring, and the whole policy is collapsing. And I think the only way we can do is to stay out of that region, no matter how bad the events are. I just don't think we are able to fix what's going to happen, because what's happening is to some extent the result of our previous policies. Those previous policies have failed.
A report by our correspondent just earlier, Irina Galushko, talking about the U.S. accusing Iran of being part of the violence that's taking place in Syria. You have the Iranian ambassador today saying that it's Israel and the U.S. who are to blame. Where do you think the truth lies here? Who do you think is behind the uprising? Is it growing organically from the people based on the Assad policies? What do you think?
Look, I am no more expert than anybody to know what's going on. I'm quite sure that the US is generally supporting opposition groups wherever they can, and they are intervening in many theaters. That does not mean, of course, that the revolution or the uprising in Syria is entirely manufactured by the United States. There must be a lot of discontent in Syria, as there is in many countries. Now, whether Iran intervenes in Syria, again, I don't know. I mean, you see, accusations of intervention and interference have been going all over the place, but there is no doubt in my mind that the United States has attributed itself a unique right to intervene everywhere in the world. So if Iran intervenes in Syria, they consider that as unacceptable, but they see nothing wrong with them intervening everywhere in the world, in Korea, in Africa, in the Arab world, in Iran, etc. And of course having wars going on. So it seems to me that we are at a turning point where we have to choose between continuing the warlike policy of the last 10 years and maybe get involved into a generalized war in the Middle East, or else back from that policy, we retreat from that policy of permanent wars and choose the path of peace and cooperation, even though the situation in the short term may be tragic in Syria, in Libya, and other places. It seems to me that we are not qualified to solve the problem of that region, and we have shown it by the failure of our policies.
All right, thanks very much. Jean Bricmont, author of the book Humanitarian Imperialism.